My name is Christophe Robert. I'm not an economist, I'm a sociologist, and I work for the Abbé Pierre Foundation, which was created about 20 years ago. And its first mission is to help the associations through money coming from public generosity, so meaning that we do not receive public subsidies. And unfortunately, the mic is off. Thank you. So we have a second mission that is related to knowledge about the phenomena related to poor housing conditions and the policies that are required to improve the housing market. And this is the part I am responsible for within this foundation. So it's very difficult, of course, in only 10 minutes to give you an overview of this foundation and to tell you about the recommendations that we make, but I would like to be as brief as possible. We are in a disastrous situation in France from the housing point of view. If we look at all the people who are living in precarious conditions, people who are homeless, people who live in camping sites throughout the year, people who live in overcrowded units, people living in attics, in parking lots, in commercial spaces transformed into housing. We have 3.5 million people who are badly, poorly housed in France. But we also have to look at people who are in a fragile or precarious situation, people who are threatened of being evicted simply because they cannot pay their rent or simply because they are going through very difficult times. We have about a figure of 10 million people who are directly or indirectly affected by this housing crisis in France, out of 65 million in France. So this is a major problem in our society in France, and this problem is tending to grow, actually. This problem is growing, and I would like to highlight a series of indicators that are being used in order to understand why France, which is a rich country, is now found in such a bad situation from the housing point of view. So first, a few indicators about the deficit. Contrary to what has just been said, we have a shortage of housing units in France, and this is a problem that is shared by and reflected by the politicians. We do not question this fact. So apparently we would require 800,000 to 900,000 housing units in France. And this shortage is related to a lack of construction and new buildings, actually. For the last 20 to 30 years, we have not built enough compared to the immigration waves we have, the demolition activities that have been carried out, etc. So we are facing a deficit. And then there is another indicator beyond this deficit, and there's probably a link between the two, because this deficit is leading to an increase in the prices. The prices of real estate have doubled for the last 10 years on average. This is an average. So the prices have doubled. So that's quite significant. The prices of rent, so this concerns 2.5 million inhabitants and households trying to find a new housing. These prices have increased by 50% in 10 years only. Parallel to that, the fees, the additional charges have also increased, and I think that this is a problem that can be found in other European countries, but we have witnessed a major increase in the prices of gas and electricity. Then the personal support mechanisms offered to households with low income, well, these mechanisms did not evolve parallel to the increase of rents. So we can see that the cost of housing has increased significantly in our country. And when I say that this is a significant increase, I would like to give you a few figures. Today, the INSEE, the Public Institute in France, provides us with information saying that 25% of the budget of a household is used to cover housing costs, and this is an average. And of course, this also includes rich people who do not spend anything for their housing. So it means that it represents about 40 to 50% of households, low-income households. So you see that this is a significant figure. And in 1980 in France, households used to spend 13% of their budget for the housing costs. And today the situation has changed completely. So we have witnessed a major increase in the housing costs today. Now, this means that we are facing a shortage of housing, as it was said before, but parallel to that, we are also facing a shortage of affordable housing. So, meaning that today, the situation is such that we are very far away. The housing market is completely disconnected from the means of households for the private housing stock, but also for the private rental housing stock, but also for social housing in a way, because we see that sometimes the new social housing units have costs that are actually too high for low-income households, because we have had an increase in the construction costs, and we also have a reduction in the intervention of the state. So we have a real disruption in the supply of new housing units for all categories of people. Now, in this framework, we have seen that we have more and more victims of the housing crisis. So now today in France, middle classes are also faced with this housing crisis. It was not the case 15 years ago. Today, having a job in France doesn't mean systematically that you're going to have good housing conditions, because having a job is not going to protect you from precarious housing conditions. Then we have carried out a diagnosis, and I will then tell you about our proposals. And this is something that is very concerning for us within the Abbé Pierre Foundation. It is the increase of territorial segmentation and the segmentation of the city, because we are in a context of shortage and of an increase in the prices. And every time we have a new housing unit that is being sold or rented, well, we have only a small share of the population that can have access to these dwellings, meaning that we have cities that are really become segmented and concentrated. So you have areas where you have a lot of dwellings and a lot of jobs, and this territorial segregation is very concerning, and it's very difficult to evaluate that thanks to statistics. But of course, this will lead to major problems when it comes to the coherence of our society. So to conclude on this diagnosis, I would say that nowadays housing is at the heart of inclusions in our country, and it is at the heart of all inequalities of our country. Territorial inequalities, as I just said, but also inequalities between the people who can have access to home ownership in these conditions, and in good conditions, of course, because we know that we talked about the problem in Spain, etc., but we see that more and more in France we have inequalities from the point of view of housing, and these inequalities become bigger and bigger because of the problems of the housing market and the real estate, and this is a problem for the cohesion of our society once again. So the Abbé Pierre Foundation made a diagnosis in a 250-page report that is published every year, and this is an independent report carried out with sociologists, different partners, associations. So in this report, we have highlighted the period of the presidential elections in France, and we know that for the Abbé Pierre Foundation, this is a great opportunity if we want to launch a new housing policy that would take into account the mistakes made in the housing market in our country. Now, I do not want to be too long. You just asked me to tell you about our approach, but what we did is actually that we consulted real estate partners. We worked with the Social Union for Habitat for social housing issues. We worked with associations as a whole. We worked with experts during 1 year and a half in order to try and define the basis, the foundations of a new social contract for a new housing policy that would be based on this diagnosis and that could lead to new prospects in terms of housing in our country. And so, in a nutshell, I'm going to try to tell you about the guidelines of the social contract that was signed by most of the stakeholders. You know that for the moment we are waiting for the election of our new president, but one of the candidates actually signed this social contract. François Hollande signed it. Nicolas Sarkozy has not signed it yet. We are currently negotiating that. We still have 10 days ahead of us. And this is based on 4 major pillars. I'm not going to go into the details of the proposals, but I would like to tell you about the global philosophy that we have adopted for this intervention. The first pillar is related to the building. Of course, we need to build more dwellings because we are facing a deficit. This is fundamental to guarantee the economic balance of the market and in order to respond to the needs in quantitative terms. So I think that this is the first commitment that has to be made. So we need to build more dwellings. We need to have a real estate policy, a land policy. This is not the case in our country. And we need to make sure that we have enough reserves in the future in order to build different categories of housing in the future. We need to build more, which means that we also have to build better. We need to build where housing is needed, where we need dwellings in order to respond to the needs of people. And these dwellings should be adapted to the means of these households. So we have to review the supply of housing. This seems to be quite obvious, but this is not what has happened in the last 10 years. So we have sometimes built very expensive dwellings that cost 50,000 euros per dwelling. Sometimes we build new housing units in areas where housing was not required. So this is absurd. So sometimes we do not respond to these housing needs simply because we wanted to maintain jobs in the construction sector, but without thinking about the purposes of these dwellings. And this cannot be accepted, of course, in the view of the situation we have today. This also means that we need to reinforce the social housing system in France. It works properly, but we still have to adapt some elements. We also have to be closer to the means available for households. But this system works properly. We simply have to strengthen it. But of course, we cannot consider that this will be the only solution to respond to people's needs. We also have to make sure that private providers also create social housing units. So I'd like to come back to the tax issue because in the debate that we have for the presidential elections, we're saying that we should not pay anymore. But I think that we should try to invest in a private rental sector with social compensations. This should be at the level of social housing. So investors should be able to invest in the housing market with social counterparts and safeguards. I do not want to go into the details, otherwise I won't have enough time to tell you about the other pillars. The second pillar, which is new for the Abbé Pierre Foundation and which is more controversial, is related to market regulation. We have not always recommended this market regulation, but today the situation is not working anymore and we cannot wait for a potential recovery in production. We cannot wait for a potential new balance at the level of the market, because today people are suffering because they're living in poor housing conditions or because they do not have a housing unit. And in France, there are no constraints in terms of the level of rent that is imposed. You can do whatever you want. And I think that it is high time, since we're during the presidential elections, to do something and to think about some kind of regulation. We should not block anything and stop the system. We should not prevent investors to go on investing, of course, but we need to strike the right balance between these investors and the level of rents. And it's not the level of rent, that should be the only indicator to before making an investment. And I think that this investment is still quite profitable today. But we should regulate the real estate issue, the land issue. What do we want to do with public buildings? Do we want to promote social housing? Do we want to anticipate the future of the city? And then the third pillar, and I'll be very brief, is the protection of the most vulnerable, because in the current situation, we cannot go on like this. We have more and more evictions, we have more and more energy, poverty, people who can no longer heat their dwelling, and I think that there's a whole challenge here that has to be taken up, and it is essential. And then finally, we have to fight against territorial segregation. This is a major challenge. And of course, we need to promote social mix in neighborhoods. We need to promote job creations, education, transport. And in the housing sector, we need to have affordable housing. And you know that we have an obligation to have 20% of social housing in some neighborhoods, in some areas. And the candidate François Hollande signed our agreement saying that we should move up to 25%. Some municipalities do not want to make efforts to accept vulnerable people, and I think that we should impose this obligation on them, and this could be a solution. And finally, I think that we should not be dogmatic. We should look at the situation of households today, and we should try to strike a balance on the market so that we can respond to the needs of these households. Thank you.